Ladies and gentlemen, it's another episode of The Big Boys Table. We're biggin', boyin', and tablein' over here, and Mesk joins me once again to talk about strategy games. How are you?
Hi, I just woke up.
Perfect. So you should be able to tell us in great detail about some stupid shit that's happened for the shitpost section. Or if you have nothing, we can just actually get into the topic.
Oh, I got. God, this shitpost section.
Yeah, that's a regular bit now.
My grandmother has discovered the wonders of the Kindle and Amazon book selection, which is not curated in any shape or fashion whatsoever. So you've got a lot of grifters on there that sell these religious books. And by a lot of grifters, I mean, I'm pretty sure it's like the same 2 or 3 people selling like the same 200 or 300 books because they're all the same, ranting about the rapture and shit like that. And well, she's as gullible as they get. So now all I hear about is the rapture every single goddamn day. And I can't, like, the last week has been so terrible. I can't make coffee, I can't make food, I can't do anything without having to be subject to this endless tirade. And like, she gets so fucking worked up about it. Like, it's just full on fucking dementia at this point. She's just saying all this shit like, oh, you can't say you love the cats if you're not willing to kneel down and suck the cock of Jesus.
Reasonable.
So,
yeah.
Yeah, some pretty malicious, hurtful wording coming from her in the last couple months, but the last week in particular, it's been just fucking nuts. So there's never a dull moment.
Yeah.
Never a dull goddamn
Well,
moment.
even when the landlord isn't forcing you to close your windows, and even when other bullshit isn't happening, where you have to start like selling off property or like random objects, then
Yeah. Oh yeah, we've been doing that too. Yep, selling off property and destroyed another wasp nest.
Oh, yeah.
And mashed more carpenter ants. You know.
dude, you're basically an
eternal
exterminator
worm.
now. They should just pay you for that, honestly.
Yeah. There's these, I don't know, I'm pretty sure they're paper wasps, the small black and yellow. I never could get a good look at them, never could identify them, but I'm pretty sure they're paper wasps, and they're just popping up nests everywhere and not even defending them, so I just blast them with the hose when I see them. So it's been really hot and humid, but we haven't had too much rain now, so hopefully the yard work will slow down a little bit and let me catch up on other stuff, because I wanted to get work done on the Unreal project this month, but right now it's like the just lunacy, everything going on in real life, and then just trying to catch up on my one D&D game that we had a game with last night. That's taken up all my time in the moment.
Yeah, well, hopefully you can start getting ahead in terms of progress. It's always a bit lately. I've been feeling a similar way about how like I have this ever growing list of things that I ought to do across multiple different projects, just similar to your situation, but. When you go a long period of time just doing work without necessarily taking a moment to maybe reflect and plan, at least I find those moments to be very instructive and useful. And if you're constantly dealing with the next bullshit that happens, it's really hard to get down to a point where you can actually consider what might need to be done. You know what I mean? So,
yeah. Well, it's like I said before. You have when you're in a high stimulus environment. Yeah. And you're on that for a very long time, for any given reason, it takes a really long time to wind down from that. I haven't had a chance to wind down from high stimulus for a good 8.5 years now. Like this has been it has really just been nonstop. And, 8.5 years ago, I had all kinds of plans and all kind of shit I wanted to do. That's when I was really, working harder in StarCraft 2 and stuff like that. And then, Unreal came out, and it's like, I really want to get into this, but there's always something going on that takes the most of your energy and time. Like, these days, the only time I really have to myself is usually at, like, an hour or two before I go to sleep. That's the only time I really got peace and quiet. I'm not running around with my hair on fire. And, of course, like, there's the video projects that have been eternally backlogged, cast overs. Now we're talking about, like, Unreal. I need the time and the motivation to sit down and learn stuff so I can start making stuff. And I can't even set aside the time to even shit in a bucket.
And shitting in a bucket is very important. At least pissing in a bucket is very important, as my uncles have taught me. So I'm sure shitting one.
As David Manning told me.
Yeah. Well, actually, I think it's long enough distant in my past now that I don't mind admitting that there was indeed a time where I had to put a trash bag in a bucket and take a shit. So That was just a regular reality.
I know someone who had
me.
to go through that because their apartment just decided to shut down all their sewage or something for a couple weeks.
Oh, yeah. Well, it was kind of similar for me, except instead the toilet was just broken and nobody fixed it. Like, I guess it probably needed something that we didn't have on hand to fix, but it was pretty fucking disgusting, so...
That kind of reminds me way back at the last place I lived. They spontaneously decided to shut down all plumbing in the entire neighborhood and start drilling. I guess they went to replace a pipe and something. But I counted. They cemented over and then dug it back up 13 times. They would cement it over, it would dry, they would dig it right back up and fuck around with it again. I don't know what they were doing.
Clearly they didn't either.
Canadian engineering is really something else. Yeah. It really is something else to watch that. Oh no, the whole time you got no water, you got no plumbing. You know, the shit's piling up.
Literally.
Yeah,
this is the shitpost section, but literally now.
It is literally shitposting.
It's pretty reasonable.
I wouldn't trust a fucking Canadian to build a paper bag, much less handle goddamn plumbing. Jesus.
Yeah, that's why they all import all those jobs, dude. Come on.
That's really what they do. They do things differently in India, in my experience. That's for sure. They do things very differently.
Yeah, they just start digging a fucking canal for you.
Yeah, pretty much.
So the topics for today are related intrinsically to strategy games, but we have a bit of a segue. Not that it fucking matters because we just shitposted, but we have a bit of a segue between the previous episode and this episode. So I'm sure that counts for something. So we were talking very heavily about bonds, and one of the bonds that we touched on particularly was bonds with characters. And you mentioned in the Discord server this past week that you've noticed that a lot of people go for unit veterancy or heroes or some other silly implementation that we believe just doesn't work within the context of an RTS mechanistically. But the reason why it seems attractive for people is so that they can forge these sorts of bonds with either units or characters as the game plays on. Now, obviously, based on our conversation in the previous episode, it seems pretty likely that both of our sort of ideas would be that you come to the conclusion that there's a better way to forge bonds with that. You just have really impactful unit responses maybe for individual units and have this like iconic or consistent at the very least thematic presentation of what the unit is. And you try to tap into like what kind of power fantasy does this unit satisfy? You know, maybe it's a big swarming unit, so you build like 20 of them, and then you feel that sort of power fantasy delivered upon by your usage of the unit, plus all of the audio visuals. And then maybe it's like an individually powerful unit just has this really oomph, like bassy attack sound and stuff like that. Could go a long way towards contributing towards this general feel that the unit is, you're able to forge a bond with the unit because of the fact that it's so consistent with the way that it's presented, and what is actually being presented is good. That would be one angle that I would take for units. But maybe we can say a few words about why Veterancy and Heroes are so attractive, even despite the fact that, you know, it seems the conventional wisdom would be just do the other things well, like unit responses and audio visuals for sound effects, like the fact that they have various attack sounds and stuff. So what came to your mind as far as that? What brought on the thought that, Veterancy is often used in this way? Because I didn't really think about it in this context, but when you sent that message on the Discord server, I was pretty sure that, yeah, actually, that's true. A lot of people do feel like heroes have to be there so they can get attached to characters and stuff. Why is this a fallacy? Can you explain it for us?
First, I think what it comes from is from developers who don't play games mostly. What they probably had happen is, it is something I've seen sort of, it's not like a really... It's not one of those super major facing things that you see, like when people talk about the games, like say multi-building select or one of these other things people end up arguing about. But it is something you've seen where people tend to certain units because of something happened in the game. Like, this one scout helped me kill like 13 mutalisks. So I'd rather not lose this scout because I formed an attachment. And I think that this sort of happened in a focus marketing environment, and people were like, oh my god, well, this is an interaction we can play off with. We can have Veterancy and Heroes to reward you for this. But the thing is that these attachments all form organically. It's from something that happened in the game. It's not something that was forced. And the Veterancy and the Heroes is something that is forced. And especially in the case of Veterancy, it hasn't ever worked properly. It's always just introduced a ton of problems, made things more difficult to read. And it's actually even played against bonds in certain ways because, again, bonds form organically and they're not always going to form for the same person for the same reason. And in most cases with Veterancy, it's just complete chance. Or it's some very technical thing that you really do not have much control over as an average player. Like, I think in one of the CNC games, someone said it's the actual amount of damage that they've done to a unit, which you're going to have a hard time tracking in any kind of scale. So, the problem with heroes, of course, is that heroes, they're either going to be useless or they're going to be something you have to babysit and you're going to form a negative bond with it, like, say, for example, all of Brood War and everything related. Or they're going to be like StarCraft 2, where we have to have heroes, but we don't want to feel like you have to hide them in your base, so we're going to make them respawn every 30 seconds, or you have to pay for them to respawn. Also, they're going to be absolutely fucking busted. Or then we have Warcraft 3, where they tried to make the entire game based around heroes, and then as a result, you didn't even have a game afterwards. And when you force these things, for one, it feels shoehorned in. Like, the heroes in Warcraft 3, they take so much away from the game in terms of the decision-making you can make. Especially on a competitive level, there's always going to be a best choice on which hero you can take, which skills you level up first, and everything like that. The entire idea of forming a bond around the hero or having a unit they really put a lot of attention to is immediately dispelled because, for one, it's treated as a chore. The hero is not something that you opt into as a player as a part of your strategy. It's something you have to build because the entire game is based around heroes. If for some reason they have their Farseer and you don't, well, you're going to be getting shot by lightning and dogs every day. And as a result, when you interact with the enemy heroes on top of it, there's no engagement about that either. Sure, it's a big important unit, but it's just a big important unit because the game says it is. Not because the player put any particular effort into anything that's going on, it's because they built their hero, here it is. It's just a centerpiece. But because I tried to work so hard to try to make that hero the centerpiece in these big, epic, important units, the rest of the game has sort of fallen in the background. I mean, Warcraft 3 is basically a turn-based RTT. There really isn't macro play. The combat, you could cook lunch in the time it takes for combat to resolve between two units of Warcraft 3, much less a large-scale fight. And the actual individual interactions are not very big, epic, or striking either. Plus, the heroes can only be played one way, so the interactions with them will always be the same way anyways. Bonds are something you have to form organically, which is really the thing I was going to extend in with the previous discussion, but of course it is such a long-winded thing to get into, is how I would try to form bonds with the player character in the ARPG is really where the goal of the original discussion for the whole thing was going for. And why I was focusing a lot on trial by tribulations and organic bonds with units. All the formations I've ever seen of that is as a result of something that happens in the actual gameplay. So you maybe have like Boxers and Mortal Marines. Marines that kill lurkers. That in itself is an interesting, striking thing because it's not something that happens in itself. It's something that has to happen organically. It has to happen as a result of the player interacting with the units. And then the player will develop a bond with the units because he's expressed power with the units in a way that, for one, is unconventional, 2 is unexpected, and 3 completely turns around what you might expect with the counters. Because you think, well, the Lurker does 20 base damage and the Marine is, 40 base health. And the Lurkers also deal huge AoE and have long range.
Yep.
Obviously, the Marine is at a tremendous disadvantage, and that's without even accounting for the fact you can stick Lurkers on ramps or in narrow corridors or whatever. And now you have someone like Boxer who just turns around and says, well, I'm just going to kill all these Lurkers with these Marines, and there's really not going to be too much they can do about it at all. Now, just even by watching that, you form a bond between the idea of the Marines killing Lurkers and the player. That's an organic bond that is formed as a result entirely through interaction, rather than because the game just said, oh, this and that. I mean, the game said, oh, Lurkers counter these units because their stats are so much better. Well, the end result was different, and then that end result in itself creates an organic response, which when you interact with it or see it, it's going to create a bond. That's what you're looking for. Then your Marines are effectively heroes. They're heroes with all the fanfare. You really want to stay away from fanfare and ceremony in games. And by fanfare and ceremony, I'm referring to all these forced interactions to try to grab your attention, to try to force you to think a certain way. You're going to see it more often in phone games and everything related. Loot boxes with their opening animations, shaking the screen, flashing lights, the little delay before it reveals what you see. That's all part of something that is called ceremony. And the ceremony is one of the most cancerous psychological things that's ever been introduced into video games, period. The whole idea behind it is just, once you know what it is, once you identify it, once you understand the goals for it, it'll make you sick to the gut every single time. Ceremony is applicable to a whole ton of wide range concepts, but we can even just go back to the whole process of leveling up a hero within Warcraft 3. You have this big, giant, vertical pillar of light as if you've actually accomplished something difficult. And, you know, leveling up doesn't have to have this visual cue that is so ridiculously over the top like that to tell the player that something has happened, but it's there intentionally because it's part of the ceremony. It's all part of the psychological effort to get the player to feel like it's a big moment, and through big moments become attached to either something that's going on or a specific unit. But that's not how real bonds are formed, and that's why all these interactions and all the games and all the heroes and everything within Warcraft 3 are entirely forgettable. What people will remember is the things that they accomplish with individual things, and that will always be the case. Or maybe it's something they witnessed as a spectator being accomplished. Again, Boxers and Moral Marines. Those are interactions. And the way that bonds are formed is through interactions. And things like Heroes and Veterancy, they only muddy interactions even before you start talking about bonds to begin with. They force you to behave, to think, to view things in a certain way. And every single time you add an extra layer of abstraction that says you have to look at things this way, this is precisely how things work regardless of, what you are trying to do with them. You may think, I'm just going to mass grunts and headhunters because I like grunts and headhunters. But then for some reason they have, a hero. And you don't have a hero because for some reason you just didn't like the hero. Well, you're in for a bad time because you don't have a hero, and heroes where all the power budget of early game goes into, and where all your eventual power budget for investment of time goes into within those games. The hero is statistically weighted in such a way, not just because of the stats and leveling up, but because of the special hero armor and damage type, that they're horrendously biased against you. So you have to interact with that system, interact with the game. It's not an RTS anymore. And all those interactions serve to muddy the waters at the very best of times, if not outright prohibit the kind of organic interactions that you would expect out of what eventually led to the creation of these systems. Because I firmly believe that this sparked as people who just were not good at the game, that would just play around with individual units. Of course, we had the micro missions and stuff like CNC1 and StarCraft 1. Where now they wanted to have heroes and that kind of gameplay for some reason in the rest of the game. And that was the only thing that these developers could do themselves as players, was these point-and-click adventures. They didn't understand how to play the RTS. They were just cargo culting some other thing. Now, in Blizzard's case, with StarCraft 1, they obviously had people who were paying attention in it because it did go through many iterations to reach what it is now. But those people either left the company or were fired or became afflicted by fetal alcohol syndrome in reverse, and they just degraded back into these gelatinous pools because then he hit StarCraft 2 and nothing they did made any sense at all.
The veterancy and hero angle in particular is funny to me because, like, at least in Command and Conquer, which has unit veterancy, it makes some sense that you would have these micro missions where you can veteran up your units. Like, I don't like it, and I think it's like justifying one shit with another shit, but there's still at least like some element of like, oh, some game design went into this because the systems are interacting with each other, and there's like more space for them to interact with each other in this terrible side tangent from actual RTS gameplay, which kind of says it all, because the whole idea is that maybe veterancy, it doesn't work inside an RTS, and the only time that you see it being leveraged to some degree to actually represent something that is actually a game design system is when you have a micro mission, which is obviously not an RTS mission in the first place, like de facto, just by itself. So
the only time I've ever really seen it contribute to the game in even any manner is Dungeon Keeper 2.
I haven't played that. What was the implementation, if you remember?
So Dungeon Keeper 2 is kind of like a hybrid of an RTT and an RTS. All the units have veterancy, and they have, I think it was 8 levels of veterancy, if I'm not mistaken. And those veterancy levels add new abilities, increase their stats, attack rate, and other stuff like that. And for some units in particular, high levels of veterancy were something you really wanted to get because it made them so much stronger. You had, if I'm not mistaken, you had 2 different types of training rooms. One was like a fighting pit that you could use, and then the other was just a training room.
Yeah.
The training room only took you up to like level 4, and you had to like fight actual combat. And getting units was a lot different than an RTS. You didn't build your units; you had to like attract them, and they would have spawned on a timer. So there really wasn't even much control over it, to be fair. And except for like vampires or some stuff like that, which you could abduct enemy bodies, and yeah. So these units were typically a little more high investment, and there was less of them. So the veterancy played a lot because really, like, the units only really became super strong when they had high veterancy.
And it's one of those things where, I mean, I remember hearing you say that veterancy wasn't, it was tolerable in Armies of Exego as well. I don't know if you have retained information about that.
I think it was because it was so easily ignored in Armies of Exego. Like, I didn't even remember it even being in there.
Yeah, well, it's like you get a slight armor
like
boost
CNC.
or something as an aura when you have a level 3 footman, for example. I think that was one mechanic where they get like some radial benefits or something. As like it's supposed to be a leadership perk, I guess, but it does contribute, in my opinion, to this like weird bloat where you can't account exactly for precise unit stats, and it's not based on something that like it wasn't even an upgrade. It wasn't something that like they activated an ability or just had a passive. It was they get this passive by killing stuff. So, or like witnessing combat, maybe. I don't remember exactly how you got XP, but I know that the Fallen had a weird mechanic where all of their units witnessing XP or witnessing, like, getting XP at all would contribute towards this like soul chamber thing that leveled up your units passively, which probably wound up making them really powerful because you didn't have to like, it was a global upgrade basically. It was like another level of weapon and armor upgrades basically. So I feel like that's
it's been a long time. I forget all this stuff with Exego. So and I guess in terms of the campaign, it wasn't visible enough for me to even really notice, which is both a good point and definitely a very bad point. But I don't think it was quite as bad as like in CNC, where like a rocket launcher man will suddenly gain like double or triple attack speed and will just start machine gunning down tanks left and right.
Yes.
Or the airships, which really needed veterancy to be really good. And yeah, like veterancy, and the worst examples I can think of veterancy is Supreme Commander, because you had the Seraphim Commander with their regeneration upgrades, and then the veterancy regeneration plus the health bonuses you would get when hitting. Like I can't remember if that game actually had a maximum veterancy cap. If they did, it was very high. And there was plenty of cheese, like early Monkey Lord Rush, where the Monkey Lord would just get kills and keep healing itself from gaining veterancy. And the Seraphim Commander was the same way, where they would just effectively become immortal, and there's nothing you could do stopping them from just walking around the map, just destroying all your shit. So this was in a game where people hated the very idea of micro. They hated that you could move from one point to another and quickly reclaim a tree or something along the way. They despised APM above like 20, so the veterancy was really, really stupid when coupled with any kind of control whatsoever.
Well, the developers for Planetary Annihilation, who were trying to appeal to the Supreme Commander and Total Annihilation crowd, said that they were making a deliberate design decision to remove micro from the game. So, like, they just said that, which is really telling. That was
amazing.
That wasn't like provoked. It wasn't a leading question. They were like, "Hey, will you have individual unit upgrades or behaviors?" And they were like, "No. We want to remove micro." So, okay. Reasonable behavior. So yeah, I don't think that veterancy contributes positively, especially because of the scaling factor. And I think we've covered pretty well here how you would form the bonds again, organically is probably the best word to describe it, because it just happens, and it's something that you can't really try to account for. I mean, if it's a character, you hope that you can account for that based on the fact that they are a commander, and so you observe them as an ally or as an enemy, or you act as them, or something to that effect. Acting as them is a little bit harder. Maybe we'll have a dedicated episode talking about player characters in an RTS or something, because that's one of those things where it's like, I know you had planned some like silent protagonists, and I know that like, I have my own personal aversion to that, but at the same time, when you're dealing in something as particular as an RTS game, characterization has to come from the gameplay primarily, and like the play, essentially, like how that what that commander's playstyle is, or how they lead an army, if you want to use non-player oriented terms. And that's super variable when it's an actual player. So I guess probably like as an example or a teaser for what that conversation could look like, we would probably talk about how you would write dialogue with that in mind and stuff, because you basically need to have other characters react to what the player is doing, and then have many variants for the play. If the player is basically following the perspective of a protagonist that is a character and is not a silent protagonist or whatever, like an insert for the player character, then you'd have all sorts of other issues. But generally speaking, the bond forming for characters in an RTS game or a strategy game should happen through how they interface with the game, how they appear to be interfacing with the mechanics of the game, and how they appear to be using the units that they have access to. And that's like a characterized version of the individual unit bond, which is like, this unit I did something really well with this unit, or I witnessed something really impressive with this unit. There's an interaction that then made me think, holy shit, like, you know, this particular guy's Marines are so powerful. I can't believe that he was able to do that. Like, he basically has like I mean, you even see that with commentators sometimes. I can't remember any exact instances, but I know I've heard something like, his Marines are just immortal, you know, like stuff like that, where they're literally saying like, this guy has a different unit almost than everybody else does, because that's what it feels like when he's going up and using these units in such an effective way. You know, you think of Bisu and stuff as well for stuff like that too. So you just get these bonds formed with individual units and individual characters in a way that happens by virtue of the interactions. And when you have that, I think that's maybe the stumbling block that I have is probably more so on the character side than the unit side, precisely because there have been so few actual serious attempts at an RTS campaign where that has characters, where the characters are supposed to be consistent. Because, you know, in Brood War, you get told, oh, Zeratul is a formidable opponent, but anytime Zeratul's on the map, he's just as stupid as everybody else in terms of, like, he's just going to attack you with a couple Zealots, or he's going to have, like, you know, a couple Dark Templar. Like, you think of when he's actually leading the battle, there's a single vanilla mission that I can think of where he's leading Protoss detachment on Char, and it's that stupid gimmick mission where if a single Dark Templar goes to a beacon, you lose. And by the way, there were 3 beacons. So
3.
That's stupid.
That's
yeah,
3.
that's 3 as well. And so the whole thing is just dumb, obviously. Like, how do you... Like, just the way that he behaves there, and it's like, okay, maybe he was drunk on that mission. Maybe that's why he's an idiot. Or maybe there's just no connection between what the narrative tells you, the dialogue tells you, and what's actually happening in front of your eyes. So you need a counterexample to that, where somebody says, somebody presents themselves as competent, and other characters in the world assume that he is competent with the way that they talk. Like, you can read that they are fearful of what this person will do, or you can read that they are, respectful in their approaches to them. But then you get in game, and it actually also happens. We need a counterexample of that. We really don't have that as like a big seminal moment inside the RTS genre. There's not really a single project anywhere or product where the characters actually display competence in accordance with what what the player has been led to believe based on the dialogue. And that goes for dialogue that's actually better written than Brood War, although I can't really think of anything off the top of my head. I'm sure it's out there for RTS games where they haven't just said literally Zeratul is a formidable opponent like Kerrigan does in Brood War, which is such like a beating you over the head with a characterization. It's more like, more subtle stuff like saying, even just saying something like this is going to be a tough battle is better than that, even though it's pretty generic. Because if the characters are acting as if that is it, or they're really like they behave upset or react in a very negative way when this character is revealed to be on the opposing force, then it's like, oh, well, they wouldn't do this over somebody that was just like a pissant fucking, officer from some backwater Terran nation. If it's like a more imposing presence or something, then maybe that's why they're reacting that way. And you kind of read between the lines, and that actually means characterization is at play, but dialogue is its own fucking disaster in games. So I guess the final point that I'm making about heroes and characters and bonds is just that making them heroes, and I said this in the previous episode too, making them heroes just confuses the matter more, because if one of these heroes is actually calling the shots and leading the battle, then you have to square not only what the dialogue tells you about them and what the in-game experience of playing against them or with them is, but you also have to combine that with whatever characterization you see of them as a unit, which is often very different. And then you get situations where they're beating a grunt in a corner instead of doing something more productive, like being on the front lines, leading the battle, and using their abilities. When they're doing like that, that's 3 different angles of discordance, where
that's 3.
You've got the stupid dialogue telling you they're really competent, then they're really incompetent as a leader, and they're stuck in a corner. Like, what the fuck? Why is this even happening? So that's probably like the biggest issue with implementing a hero as it pertains to bonds. And then there's all the gameplay effects. So I don't know if you had any sort of last thoughts on Veterancy and heroes before you move on to some of the other systems here.
I was going to comment on characters. I have so many goddamn scripts written for RTS.
Okay.
And I was shuffling through them, but I can't find actually any examples immediately offhand. There's just too much shit on my hard drives. But no, I took dialogue really seriously. Right. It would be nice if I could at least find the last one that I worked on, but I guess I can't. LMAO.
Well, if you find it later, I can always add it to the notes.
Yeah. So it's there was like Apex's script I wrote initially in 2012, and that went through a gabillion different iterations, back and forth. RTS scripts obviously is really difficult to write for, and like I have mentioned before, some of these scripts are really long. There's some long intermission between the missions. Cinematics will probably be like, I don't know, something could be like a half an hour long with the way that the dialogue is. But those are like 30, 40 missions in, right? So I usually save the longer stuff for later on when you actually had some context and some investment and stuff that was going on. When it came to the intermission dialogue, having the dialogue be sensitive to what was going on, particularly when he ended the map, was important to me. Now, not every map had this, but any map where it was really important, you would have... Yeah, I would like, if I was to describe them, I'd say soft objectives that were not exposed to the player unless it was a really important mission objective, like trying to defend something or something like that. But there were many maps where there was a soft objectives that would determine what the end of dialogue and end of mission dialogue was. Where you might get a line about, okay, the enemy is defeated, let's move on. But if you performed really well, they'd be like, so this is the God of War at work.
Right.
Something like that. Or if you had a really hard time and bad shit happened, like non-essential objectives were destroyed, or whatever there is, say, that was a lot more difficult than we expected, or something like that.
Having it reflect, like the end state dialogue basically reflects how the experience was, for sure.
And some of them could be based also, like I would track like kill counts versus death counts and stuff like that. So if you had a good KDA, you'd probably get some adjustments to that. Now, you would end up... There was some of these more complex missions. You could end up with 20, 30 different sets of dialogue that would be... whichever one you got would be different depending on the end result, because there was one that was an FFA with like 7 different factions. And if you were the one to defeat all of them, then you ended up getting like the hard mode completion dialogue.
Sure, yeah.
So... as opposed to handing players these little ceremonies and this little text that says, wow, you completed the mission in under 30 minutes. You're such a great player. Wow. We would
bonus void mission unlocked.
Yeah, oh god, Metzen's vomit ready for you to taste. You are the war chief. Yeah, no, yeah, there would be actual in-game stuff for this too. So, of course, with the actual characters and stuff like that, a lot of the times within this, I try to treat the dialogue as being more, well, realistic's the way I go with things. And that's why I try to go with the organic
Sure, yeah.
interactions. As we sometimes would have just short, very short dialogue. That would be. I don't have any examples here, unfortunately. But oh yeah, in this campaign, Goatsy Man was actually a character, and he was a wise sage who expanded his lower to the higher. So
Is that another way of saying that he swallowed himself?
the sages of the lower, I believe, was his faction. Yeah, and these old scripts are an absolute hoot. So a lot of these missions, you might get like one or two bits of dialogue when you first start that is like an ally telling you about the general state of the engagement. Something like, look, they have brought orbital platforms, or they have called for reinforcements from the Confederacy, and I guess we'll be fighting two of them, or something like that. There's very, very rarely is a lot of working up. There's sometimes, like, I mean, some of these longer cinematics, you sometimes might have some kind of build up to a confrontation or something like that. But when we enter the actual map themselves, I tried to tend away from generalizations like, this guy is so strong, he's going to really kick the shit out of us. I try to make it much more personal, where if the characters are concerned about something that's going on, they will say something that's much more direct. Like, they might say, like, as an example, like, this guy's been on a warpath all the way up the point to reach us. Like, it's up to us to stop him here. So, it'll be something that's less flowered up in the sense of setting up that expectation and more of a sense of setting up the confrontation. So this is something that would take me forever to try to describe because I'm not so good with words. But the way that I wrote the dialogue was more about two people who knew each other discussing things. Especially in the case of like the newer, I've talked about it, the newer Apex where you had the Federation commander who was aware of who you are and you were aware of who they were, and you two had been fighting for a long time prior to us actually getting into the campaign. Yeah. So when you interact with each other, we avoid all those really overt generalizations and, repeating stuff that we wouldn't repeat in a natural conversation between these two characters that we have in pretty much every single modern game, where when two characters who meet each other have to say something, then we usually have to, like, pause the game, shake the screen, show the name and shit like that. And their dialogue will be basically the same thing. They'll be like, oh, wow, that's Lord Frank, captain of the Asshole Brigade. We've been fighting for years. Like, at that point, I'd be like, what the dialogue would really be like, oh, it's that asshole Frank again. I guess he's come back to stir more shit.
Yeah. You get all of the same characterization if you just have intelligently written dialogue.
It's just the way of writing the dialogue is very different. Like what I was hoping to find was some examples, but what I'm finding right now is the Goatsy Man talking to a Protoss who's actually going Super Saiyan. So those old scripts don't really work quite well because, I mean, those scripts, actually, I feel like those scripts are still really good. I managed to make all this stuff work really well. I've been able to work with ridiculous things in serious settings for 20-something years. But, like you said, there's no actual working examples.
Yeah.
Within an actual RTS. And this stuff would have been tough to pull off in an RTS. It probably would have gone through a lot of extra iterations. And it was actually written down. There's a couple example cinematics I made way back that I felt were promising, but then I got to the AI with StarCraft 2, and it was like, well, if that's not going to work, I'm not going to bother. So
the classic.
It's something I think to return to at a later time, but yeah, with the characters, it's the same thing. I mean, the unit veterancy thing, I think, is like the attempt to inject characterization into units that are nameless and try to make people feel more involved in individual units as sort of a alternative. angle to view the whole micro mission thing is because in the CNC one you had the special units like Tanya or whatever,
the commandos,
but they basically serve no actual purpose in the entire game. They existed exclusively in that sphere, and that was the case with Brood War and StarCraft 1 as well. But these were the forces who were supposed to be your commanders, so they're trying to characterize it as them being involved in this conflict. But that never evolved organically. In fact, the organic response was to hide the heroes away because, as you probably saw within, I believe it was my Brood War run, I had Phoenix stashed away in my base on that Zerg map.
Yeah, and he just died.
The AI like dropped shit on him or something in the middle of when I was doing something else, and they tanked him off of a ledge or something like that, and they just killed him, and it really pissed me off. And it was like that's the organic interaction you get out of these maps with these heroes, because the whole actual interaction concept in itself wasn't thought out. They were just thinking of it as just we need to have a hero because these are our characters. Then the player wasn't ever given a chance to organically bond with any of these things or to create their own thing. The thing about bonds and stuff like that is it's going to be the player that builds them. You can't really force them. You can try to build an arena where the bond can be formed, but you can't force it because that's not really how it's going to work.
Yeah, the case of hero units or veteran units is, I agree that it is just like an injection of, oh, here, look, there's a character on the front line, or this nameless unit is more important than your other nameless units because they got 3 veterancies, and that means they attack twice as fast because LOL. And setting aside the issues of how it works intuitively in terms of the gameplay and how like it morphs engagements massively, everybody is already basically awake to the fact that if you lose a hero and that's the end of the mission, it's pretty terrible. I mean, even Blizzard know this. It's just that they haven't jettisoned heroes as a concept for whatever reason. So instead you have to
they try to force it in harder.
I mean, on the one hand, it's better than failing the mission because the hero died, although that's still not consistent because in micro missions you still fail if the hero dies. But it's also, it more heavily morphs engagements the more powerful they are, basically, right? The more power budget they have, the more you feel compelled to use them in engagements due to the fact that they are so powerful. And as this whole thing opens up, you just get farther away from what an RTS is, really ought to be. With unit veterancy, you're encouraged to have these micro segments or these sections of gameplay where you can focus super heavily on all of the calculations required to keep track of who's about to get veterancy and who's about to, get the ever sought after fucking 3rd tier of veterancy because 3, and that gives you all the extra doohickeys, whereas like the earlier tiers are much less useful, and stuff like that.
And as a result, as an extension of that, they have to be powerful enough to actually stand out in the RTS sphere, which leads to just all kinds of balancing problems everywhere.
Yeah, well, because otherwise there's no point in getting them up veterancy-wise, or they... Yeah,
there's no point in the system existing unless it's overbearing. Yes. That's their logic.
Yeah, but if it's overbearing, it fucks up the RTS component. So, basically, you're just encouraging your level designers to create these terrible micro missions. You're encouraging your players to engage with this system that takes them away from playing an RTS, because part of the reason why people look for, RTS gameplay, or one of the things they look for in RTS gameplay is scale. And scale is always attenuated negatively by veterancy, insofar as, if the default expectation is I should build more units, then you won't have veterancy, because if veterancy is only something that can even be kept track of at a lower scale. So when you have this lower scale, this mechanic that biases you towards this lower scale, you're unlikely going to have armies of hundreds to thousands of units. You're more likely to have other shit like squads and micro missions, and it just gets you down to this situation where you're very quickly not building an RTS project anymore. You're very quickly building something that just doesn't really work at all. It's not coherent from a design standpoint, and genre-wise, mechanistically speaking, it's also definitely not working. To the degree that we would expect an RTS to work, and that definitely affects balancing as well, where maybe because you have to have a lower scale, you have to have less things to think about. So we'll introduce rock, paper, scissors to the equation instead of having actual, soft counters, so to speak. So that's its own bag of worms. I guess we could pop that open now if you're interested in talking about that, because I think rock paper scissors gameplay is really like one of the worst things you can do in terms of your tech, like your different tech trees and the feeling that your game actually has unique races. Because in my mind, even if the races are unique and they don't all have a marine equivalent or a zealot equivalent or whatever, if they have this rock paper scissors thing where there's hard counters at play, then they will all feel to play relatively the same way, and you'll have a similar response like you'll have a rote response in mind when you see like a specific build opener. Instead of thinking I need a tool to deal with this, it's like I need to specifically build one unit that counters this action as well. So what are some of your initial thoughts on the rock paper scissors angle as opposed to the soft counter approach?
I try to think of an example I've seen hard counters work in any genre, and I can't come up with any. I've never seen it work. Not in my history of gaming. Every single time hard counters have ever been brought into anything, it has been to its stark detriments. Hard counters are there to dumb things down to the point that people who don't play games can play your game. That's really just the gist of it. It's just like, you are given a problem, and then you are told what the solution is. You don't have to think about it. Like you said, normally when you're handed a problem, you're supposed to have tools to deal with it. A lot of what gaming is it's problem solving. Now, between problem solving and then doing something that might be considered as a chore, that can be a fine line, and treating that line can be difficult. But when you introduce something like a hard counter, you are literally just saying this product is a chore, because you are literally just performing something that has been pre-programmed to you to perform. It's as Simon says. Yeah. So if I have, let's say, a tank, and all I have to do is build a rocket infantry that takes like 10% damage from the tank and deals double damage to the tank, that solution is going to work every time. Which means that any single time I see a tank, I just build a rocket infantry and we're done. That's it. We don't have to think anymore. We never had to really think to begin with. The solution was always the same thing. Now, I come from a background of non-competitively, but like casually, regularly playing like checkers and chess and stuff like that. So, in a sense, that has always been, I mean, those are games that have been, as far as I understand, basically, I don't know how you describe it, but they've been mapped out where if you know what to do, you have a perfect solution to everything. Well, if you're not an AI or you're not a top tier player, you don't have those kinds of skills. So at least at like my skill level, that really wasn't much of a thing. There was always players I would have difficulty against, and players I did not have difficulty against, and players where it was kind of a coin toss. It really would depend on how much I was really trying. And so, to me, the whole strategy thing has always been about using your tools and outsmarting an opponent. When we go into hard counters, none of that matters. It doesn't matter how smart you are. It doesn't matter how good at control you are. A hard counter is a hard counter, and it's called as such for a reason. The entire purpose of having a hard counter is to get rid of the whole thinking thing, the whole strategy thing. And then we enter places like Warcraft 3. Where Warcraft 3 is hard counter-centric, but now it's on top of heroes that are they are exempt from the hard counter sphere. Because, like I mentioned earlier, they have their own special needs, armor, and damage system, which was explicitly designed to set them independent from the counter system, which just muddies the whole thing just so much more. And I mean, Warcraft 3 is something that's been, it has been optimized to the point even the most casual player will always perform a perfect build, because there is only like one or two perfect builds in that entire game, competitively speaking. Although maybe that changed a little bit with Refunded. I kind of doubt it. But anyways, for the lion's share of the game's lifespan, it was basically just Druids of the Talon. And then sometimes Farseers or Blade Masters or whatever. And the other races were just kind of fucked in many ways at the competitive level. And even at the casual level, you just had the way that these counters worked, where it was like you just did this and then you didn't worry about anything, because the game was dumbed down to the point that you just focused on these specific interactions, and that was kind of it. Just because of the way that the races were made, the tech trees were made, the economy was laid out. And the way that these hard counters worked is that they even served as soft counters to everything else that a player might have access to. I remember Crypt Fiends being just a core go-to just because of the way that Burrow and Web worked. If you were encountering issues where you were having difficulties with countering unit types, it was probably because you did something really wrong, at least at the skill level where we were playing, because you really could just reach a critical mass of these, have your hero tank for them, and the player opposing to you had to work very, very, very hard to undo this, to get an advantage against you. And it was just because of the way the damage types and everything and then the abilities worked. Now, hard counters aren't always expressed just in damage types. They're also expressed in the way that abilities work or certain interaction concepts. Like, the common one is going to be ranged versus melee. That's one that for some reason modders, especially mappers at lowbrow websites like SEN have really struggled with over the years, is how to do balancing with basic interaction concepts. And ranged versus melee is really where it all begins. Because in a lot of these games, in a lot of these user-made pet projects, you're going to find that ranged units are very cheap and or just comparatively as expensive as melee units. But of course, because of the fact they're ranged, even basic micro will allow you to get power budget out of them that is just ridiculously over the top. Another example of a hard counter, of course, is point and click versus a skill shot. So I like to think back to Nautilus's ult and other similar abilities in League of Legends where you basically don't need to even think about using them. Some positional play comes into hand where you want to kind of target people where you can hit as many people with the trail of the attack as just as much as you want to hit your actual target. But in the long run, once you activate it in most circumstances that are optimal, they're just going to get hit by it, and that's going to be that. Or they're going to have to blow some kind of defensive cooldown. It's going to force a reaction of some kind at the very least. If not, it's just going to stun them, and there's nothing they can do about that. There are, at least a time when I was playing, I know the game's become a lot of a mess since then, there was just so many heroes where you basically just could not fight this character, and you could not really even attempt to engage. Because, well, I played mid laners and ADCs. And in my experience at all levels of play, from low level all the way up until against Platinum Masters, is that if you go anywhere near any bruisers or tanks, you will just get blown the fuck up. They will CC you and then they will kill you. Unless, of course, they're far behind or you are very far ahead. Upon which case, somebody else in the map probably fucked up for you to reach that point where you can just mow down their tanks. Because all the tanks in that game basically had gap closers and CC and then some other kind of utility. They literally existed to serve to hard counter you in 1 versus 1s. You were basically a number on an Excel sheet of how much damage you contributed to any given team fight. And in most cases, you would encounter a lot of these cases where your character, just because of the fact that they deal damage, they do not have the kind of options to deal with any of this other shit that these other characters do. Now, when you talk about a lot of these bruisers and tanks, like, for example, Nautilus, they can actually deal a lot of damage. They can deal a huge amount of damage. And then you have, like, Darius or whatever, where they have true damage nukes on top of it. Garen, for example, and then you factor in resets, and then the items they added that either add damage reflect, sustainer, stuff like that. When you talk about raw damage numbers, it wasn't uncommon to see tanks or bruisers at the top of damage dealt, either because they were constantly fighting in lane, or because they got ahead, or just in general, they were able to stick to targets a lot longer. But when it came to the actual, individual fights, there were so many cases where you just couldn't do anything because you had some CC targeted onto you. You either had to keep so much of a distance that you couldn't contribute to a team fight at all, or you were just going to get engaged on and you couldn't do anything at all. Olaf was probably one of the worst of those, because his ult made him CC immune. And there was so many times where I'd be playing like Jinx or Kog'Maw or something, and he would just ult, run through the fucking team fight, my whole team would be trying to kill him, and he would still just like blow me up on contact. He didn't even have to be that far ahead, just because, you can't slow him down. Now he's on you, and then he has the true damage E, the damage bonuses, and then whatever, I believe there was an item that gave you a damage bonus for a couple seconds after you got hit. I think it was one of the Juggernaut items that made you run fast as well on top of it until you got hit by something or did something, and it gave you a damage bonus or something like that. That was a really bad one if you weren't able to get away from it before the damage bonus was done. Because then he would probably get hit for like a quarter or half of your health in one hit, and then he would combo you, and then he would slow you, and then at that point, if you don't have your 3, 4, 5 minute, whatever it was, cooldown flash to hopefully jump over a ledge or something like that, you were probably just going to die. So there was a lot, like, you really would have to tend to more mobile characters to try to deal with this shit. And this wasn't as much of an issue when I first started League. But when they started introducing more and more and more items that made these interactions more and more biased, you started seeing this drift between these classes of characters. And it would reach a point where it was like you would dread fighting certain matchups because of how heavily countered they were against you. Like, even certain ADC and support lanes versus each other, you would reach a point where it was like you couldn't actually even go for a fight. You had to basically ignore your opponents and sit underneath the tower because their composition had so much engage and so much CC that if you ever were even slightly out of position, you would get hooked by someone like Thresh, who could keep you stuck in a spot for many seconds at a time, and then the ADC might have CC on top of it. You know, one of my most toxic combos I had at the time was like Tom Kench and it might have been Jinx or something like that, where you could just stick CC on top of CC, and if anybody ever got caught, they were just going to be stuck there for upwards of like 10 seconds. And then on top of it, if you were in a bad situation, Tom Kench could just suck you up, give himself a huge shield, and just walk away and usually survive. And then there was, on top of the fact that Tom Kench also did a massive amount of percentage health damage if he just hit a target a couple times, regardless of what items he had. It was just an arbitrary amount of damage. So he was always relevant for dealing damage against those annoying tanks. So they basically, the problem with hard counters that you see time and time again in League and phone games and stuff like that is you end up with certain situations that become really oppressive like that. And then the developer sells you a solution. And then that solution ends up being just as oppressive, if not more of oppressive, as the original problem. So then they sell you a solution to that. And you end up, again, in the utility creep arms race. And Blizzard was terrible with this with their Heroes of the Storm reworks. Hero reworks for both Riot and Blizzard, they just don't work out. They just don't really think things through when they're doing them. And you always end up with massive amount of utility creep, like Rhaegar's was just terrible. And then I've already mentioned the Overwatch heroes and that they just shoot multiple times. They nullify stuff like Murky's Egg. They can attack while moving. There's just like you end up with, just because of the way that things behave, they're so much stronger than everything else came up before them. It isn't even a hard number. It's like Tracer was nerfed over and over and over and over and over again. But just because of the way that hero interacted, when you had somebody with any competent skill level with her, it became to the point that most people just can't do shit against them.
Right.
You just can't do shit against them. Which means that always becomes your go-to response on either end of the fence when it's a hard counter that, when something behaves or interacts in a certain way where you really just don't have much control over the end result, that always feels like shit. It always feels like shit to be an end result of all that. Hard counters take out the whole thinking thing, and then for the person on the receiving end, it's just like, well, I guess I got countered. Great. Yeah, I guess I'll die now.
When it's obvious in champ select which team has won, you've already lost as a designer. That's the thing that I started noticing more and more as the game went on, is that people were, obviously at the professional level, they were mining the game and trying to solve it and figure out exactly what compositions worked and what pick ban orders to do.
I mean, even the casters would call it too.
Yeah, and you would see games where either during the game, during the cast, like you're saying, or even afterwards in a post-match interview, you would have the team themselves or the coach or something say, yeah, we lost that game in Champ Select. When you have this potential where, maybe you can say that, like, if it was just some complaints from plebs who were playing normals or something, I wouldn't care as much. But when it's actually professionals whose job it is to be correct about these things, either as analysts or casters or team coaches and team leaders and stuff. When you have situations like that, it's actually it's a pretty big sort of insult or an indictment of the game's development and how that works, because you are removing the actual skill check and the execution, and you're passing it on to what your unit choice is or what your hero choice is. There's some argument you can make where this doesn't hold up against the RTS example as much, because at least you have to build the unit in the first place. But the thinking angle, the fact that it sidesteps and shortcuts all of the thinking, is, I think, the biggest insult against it and the biggest issue with it. For me, I actually think that RTS hard counters, I'll credit Veek with this realization because of the way that he said it at some point made me think about this. They're trying to basically automate the decision making, but in doing so they get to the same result. It's just that it's done artificially as opposed to organically, and it's not a skill check anymore as far as the knowledge check or the strategy check or whatever that the player has to pass, if you will. When you have a game state where there's many different positions that the player can go down, and they see what their opponent has done, and they begin to try to counter that, or they try to respond to it, even, to not use the counter word for this example, they're trying to respond to what their opponent has started to build. That means that, like, on a simple level, yes, melee versus ranged, or ground versus air, what units can attack up, that sort of thing. Yes, they will have to make some decisions that you might consider to be on the hard counter side, or at least more like a counter as opposed to just a response. But the case where it's obviously different is when you're choosing to build X because they built Y, and X is always the same unit because Y, as long as Y is the same unit, because of these sort of like inalienable traits of the unit, like it's mechanical or robotic, or it has shields or something to this effect, instead of it being like, this is how the unit plays, and these are the things that my opponent can do with this tool, so I need to be able to respond to those things. It's the same system. It's the same, like, underlying element where you're making a decision in response to what your opponent has done. But it's all shortcut, and it's simplified, and it's basically automated and casualified in the sense where, like, there's no room for error. You were talking about Warcraft 3 and how, pleb players who are not very good can still play to a reasonably, maybe not high level, but they can at least execute on a build order. I don't have experience in Warcraft 3 to the same degree, but I definitely think that's true in StarCraft 2. And to a lesser extent, chess. You just look up some openers, and there's a certain amount of things where there's nothing that the opponent can do until they get to the point where they've scouted you and have responded to you. Like, there's nothing that they can do to immediately respond to that, and you have no way of, like, ever fucking it up in that sense for the build order. That you'll always have certain advantages. Now, in a sense, this is true no matter what the RTS game state looks like, because, if you just have, like, one tech path you can go down versus another, then obviously in your opening build moments before you've been engaged with by your opponent, that's always going to be something that you have that they haven't been able to respond to yet. But when they respond, and when they have to go through a decision tree, that actually tests their knowledge and their ability to project forward the amount of strength that they will have versus you, and the ability to obviously micromanage the units that they end up training in a way that maybe their power budget is expressed through this micromanagement and not just by A-moving. Then when you have a situation like that, that's not like StarCraft 2 at all. That's not like most RTSs at all. That's more like what Brood War was, even though Brood War had some egregious cases of point-and-click stuff. And obviously they had the damage types and whatnot, so there was still an element of countering there. But even in the element where there's a counter, it's like Vultures versus Hydralisks or Vultures versus Dragoons, where you have these units that on paper should take reduced damage, or not take full damage from the Vulture, but shields take full damage, and then the Spider Mines are a big change, and the fact that the Vulture is more mobile than both of those units is a big change. And now it depends more about how you use it. You obviously gave the Marine versus Lurker example as well. Like, there's cases where on paper and statistically you expect the interaction to go this way, but you still have an element of wiggle room as a player to express skill based on positioning, which is like a tactic, and then based on the actual micromanagement, which is more mechanical play, and then also based on your timing, which would be the more broad strategic aspect of how many you've built and where you've placed them. I guess that goes back into the positioning thing, but like the more broad, like global map thing that you've done for your army rotations and stuff. You're testing many different angles. You're testing many different skills here, including stuff that you wouldn't normally think of as a skill because it's not a mechanical thing, like game knowledge, and maybe your familiarity with this other opponent and stuff like that, and your ability to remember those things and assess these patterns across multiple games against players who maybe play like that player but are not exactly that player. There's a lot more at play here than just, oh, my opponent did this, let me do that. Like, if the game is in a state where it's much easier to solve because of hard counters, that is going to take away some enjoyment. Another thing that kind of piggybacks off of this notion is that you were talking about chess. for me, I don't play chess at a high level at all either. The fun that I have with chess, the most fun I have with chess, is when it's a really non-standard board situation where like a bunch of pieces on either side have gone down, but we have like an asymmetric board and we have like a little bit more control on one side than the other. And now we've got to like play in this way that neither of us know really. We've never been here before. It's a unique experience to some degree. There's maybe some similarities with previous games, but it's unique in its own way. And I guess that's a no-brainer that would be my favorite situation, because that's also what I look for in even just replaying the same RTS map. If it's an FFA, or if there's some element where the AI is variable, or if it's against a different opponent, then there's many different ways that the map could play out that will put me into a very unique position that is noticeably unique and meaningfully distinct from previous playthroughs, and in such a way where I have to test different skills. I have to show how good I am at adapting, as well as all of the other things, right? And so it definitely feels like hard counters, they're way worse than people realize, even though most people realize they're bad. At least most people we talk to, right? Which is like a kind of a community bias. Yeah. But like it's worse than people realize because it takes away so much. It attacks the very core of what the RTS experience offers. And when you have this element where there is a solvability to it, where you just know what response to make every single time, then that is an instance where you're not even engaging with one of the biggest aspects from a knowledge base and strategic level of what the game actually is and what it can offer as an experience. So did that little rant I had make you think of anything in particular about that? Because that's, to me, that kind of sums up the hard counter versus soft counter, that it is the same thing in a way. It's just that the hard counter is it's like a cargo cult and hollowed out version of it, where you don't really get the actual experience. Like soft counters will take you to where hard counters force you to be, but you actually have to go there yourself instead of being shown the way, you know?
Yeah, I think the most fun I had in like League was doing non-standard stuff, like Zyra mid. She mostly was played in support. There was definitely lanes that I went up against that would be considered really suboptimal, and against opponents that were really, really difficult opponents that were high skill level. But usually I was at a skill level at that point where I kind of like knew the weaknesses, and I was able to play very defensively for a long time, and I could make it work. And certainly you wouldn't have like the map presence you normally would. Luckily, you were going up against non-ranked teams where people weren't really able to abuse the map presence thing, because in a ranked match, it would absolutely be not viable. But, you know, the thing that I really hated about those games was forced conventions. Like, this hero can only do this hero can only do that. This is what their kit's based around. You know, the whole hard counter thing basically pushed you away from something that sounded interesting, you know, and forces you to do certain things in certain ways. So, and then they were balanced around that too, right? Like I said, Zyra mid, she was being balanced a lot because as a support, she was annoying as hell. And every single nerf they did for support just fucked you over out of any possibility of making it work in another lane. And then like junglers, for example, that you liked playing in lane, you know, they were being balanced. Like Nidalee, for example, I played Nidalee mid pretty much exclusively. I never did jungling. And she was oppressive as a jungler, so they kept nerfing the shit out of her, and like the trap nerf was a big one.
Oh yeah, it could no longer affect champions or something, right? It was only monsters. Something stupid like that, where it's literally just like only this class of unit can ever get affected.
Yeah, well, it used to do a lot of damage, and then they nerfed the absolute fuck out of all the damage for it, because people couldn't see the traps on the ground, and also because it was annoying as hell when it was jungling. And then they kept nerfing the spear too, because people don't know how to move away from a spear. And yeah, like the way they changed it made it just impossible to lane. And you know, it was annoying as hell, because they were forcing them into doing certain roles. And that goes in the case of all these other games that are all class-based. Like, this is one of the reasons why I hate like class-based shooters. I hate class-based RPGs and stuff like that, is because you get, I mean, the Holy Trinity is probably something that everybody will know what I'm referring to, which is the tank, DPS, healer. And everything's based on the Holy Trinity. And there's a couple games that I've played that kind of fork away from that. I guess Black Desert being one of the bigger examples of it, but Black Desert is still kind of Holy Trinity-ish. Not really, I guess, but holy shit is the netcode in that game well beyond terrible. And very, very badly balanced. Definitely not a good example for us. But an example in the sense that there was more of a free attack. It wasn't tap-targeting like World of Warcraft, for example. But, God, World of Warcraft's balance across the expansions was just so ridiculous. Just that could be a whole segue all in itself, just on what little bit I remember. It's been a long time, but obviously Holy Trinity hard counters all over the place. But when it came to duels, the healers were pretty much just unkillable, just absolutely unkillable, and a lot of tanks were just unkillable too. And then you had the whole resilience system where they didn't want people who did raiding, PvE, to be able to participate in PvP, and they didn't want people who did PvP to be able to participate in PvE. Blizzard just hated their players and wanted to fracture the player base as much as possible, and they just kept doing that for expansion after expansion after expansion. And as a result, they just continued to drive people away from their game. And I mean, that's just one of the reasons that they drove people away from the game. Hardly the worst one, but it's definitely one of the worst ones. I mean, even that goes into hard counters too, because that's a counter in the sense that it punishes your investment. Yeah. Like, there really isn't any logical explanation that somebody shouldn't be able to go into a battleground with their AQ-40 gear and be able to kill someone who is in shit PvP gear. There's no reason for that. Like, if the person's good at PvP at that point in the game, they can win no matter what the gear level is, generally speaking. And I've proven that many times. And, I mean, the class imbalances aside, you know, if somebody is super shit in that game, they're going to get punished with it as dumb and as simple as a game as it is. But when you introduce all these other things that punish you just because you didn't grind PvP non-fucking stop for however many months to get all the resilience gear, you know, that it just, like, the whole system basically becomes inaccessible to you. It's like, well, why even bother doing PvP if I have this gear? Or, you know, with the raids, it was like, the game wasn't balanced in such a manner where you couldn't carry someone. HKS actually brought this up to me, I think, a couple of days ago. He actually said, you know, one of the main problems is that they went away. Now, World of Warcraft and all these games like Final Fantasy XIV, they're all very easy games. But they're easy only if you're really super familiar with the content. The content is as Simon says. And generally in these games, if one person fucks up, every single person dies. And you have to go through potentially 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes of fighting all over again to back to where you were. Especially in Final Fantasy XIV, the fights are eternally long. And if one person fucks up, it usually kills the whole group. It didn't used to be like that. It used to be like it where you had the big 40-man raids that you might be familiar with. And like Molten Core and stuff like that. And you could have a chunk of the raid that was either window lickers, or, you know, they might fuck up really badly and get a bunch of people killed on something Varangeddon, or, you know, Cleaves from Valpass or whatever. But usually it wasn't going to be a hard wipe. Literally every single person dies if one person screws up really badly, or a part of the group screws up badly, and they all wipe hard. Now, there has been certainly some cases like Burning Crusade where it was like that. I specifically remember people getting shit on their screen, add-ons telling them run away from the group. Their whole screen's flashing, they turn around, run into the group, and kill every single person. But, you know, in most cases, it wasn't quite as bad as one person screws up and takes everything out. Which just further, like, back then, I did raid leading in classic World of Warcraft. I helped this really shitty conglomeration of boomers and moms try to do this content. And half of the group was like people who did PvP, pretty much exclusively. So they came in with their PvP gear. You couldn't do that after that, because the PvP gear and the PvE gear was getting segregated more and more and more. Blizzard basically said you had to do it this way. You had to have the gear from this. You had to do it in precisely this order, or you don't participate at all, right? You don't get to do anything.
Yeah.
You just will hold the group down. Nobody will be able to progress. Like, the hard countering is more like a mindset to me. It's I don't even look at it just as the numbers. I look at it as a mindset. And the mindset is extremely corrosive and destructive to everything it touches, because it is basically the developer saying you do it precisely as we want, or you don't do it at all. And that has been a problem with all these games, is the developers being extremely butthurt when people don't do things precisely as they intended, which is one of Blizzard's biggest problems and one of World of Warcraft's biggest problems, and hating on creativity and skill level in general. Again, you mentioned Planetary Annihilation and removing micro. Like, I feel like when I hear us talking sometimes, I feel like some people might get the wrong impression when we talk about heroes and micro maps and stuff like that we don't like micro. No, we prefer micro to be something that's actually, again, organic. Micro is my biggest strength. That's why I did so well in a lot of these Dota clones. Is because micro is my biggest strength. I don't do well in multitasking, but in no world would I ever change the RTS from the formula of having macro and micro both.
Yeah, you can't. In my view, these MOBAs usually end up feeling like half of a game anyway, because you control a single unit, so there's no excuse for you to not have to move and shoot independently like in a shooter or a twin stick game or something. But you also have you have like you don't have the rest of the control, abilities. So it's like where's the rest of the game? You know what I mean? Actually, your point about one person dying and everybody dying as a result in these WoW raids reminded me of. The state of play that League has shown in general. Riot has progressively pushed the game like very, very aggressively towards this goal of like you got to play as a team. But they still haven't resolved, as far as I know, one of the main issues with that system with their ranked model, where the game matters more and less for different people. So you might have somebody in a promo series and they solo queue it, and then somebody else is they just got demoted, so they're tilted or whatever, and there's no stakes for them in this game. They don't care, and so they don't care about throwing, and the other guy's just
it's the MMR system in general. Like honestly, like I can't remember precisely where it really began to take off, but I think League is where it really got the most exposure, is the whole MMR ranking system. And the more I've thought about it, the more I think that system is really bad. Like, just for the kind of, like, just for what you're talking about, the kind of, not just the stakes. Because when you're at a high level in something like League, a loss is far more punishing than, like, in order to make up for a loss, especially if you're, like, in a promotion series, you have to play many games to get back the points and to be back in the same position. So losses will always be intrinsically super frustrating because the system is trying to push for a 50-50 win rate. It's trying to force you into a 50-50 win rate. And I mean, you throw in solo queue or dual queue on top of it, where most people don't even... I mean, they might know each other because when you reach a high rank, you have less players, so they've played with each other and they kind of know each other. But that, not even in itself, can make the MMR system 1,000 times more frustrating, too. Like, the MMR system in general, it's not really something I've really thought about, but every time, especially in the last couple of years that it's come up, and we get to the forest win rate system, it reminds me of how Blizzard balanced all their more recent products based exclusively on win rates. They don't look at replays, they don't look at player feedback, they look only at win rates. So in Blizzard Dota, Heroes of the Storm, there was a third-party website, and it tracked win rates, and it tracked what skills and stuff were used in these win rates. They balanced exclusively based on that website. They never looked at first-party data. They never analyzed. They never played the game. They only looked at the win rates on that site. You could predict what they would do based on that website. And as a result, the balance got more and more stupid. There was one change they made that was really positive, where they reduced a bunch of stun durations. And then they introduced more CC and everything directly afterwards, because they felt that things weren't strong enough because their win rate wasn't that great. They didn't understand that the win rate came as a result of a million different factors. And that's one of the reasons why the MMR system in general doesn't work, especially in a solo queue environment. Like, I think that League should have to be balanced based on team play. I think that the hard counters and everything should be removed, and you should be based more on player tendencies and behaviors and skills and stuff like that. You should really open up the game to breathe, so to speak, as opposed to it being ranked. I don't know what it looks like today because I haven't played it in a couple of years, but back then, you had the dual lanes ADC support pretty much all the time, mid lane, jungle, top lane, and that was just... If you tried to do anything different, you'd actually get banned. Support singed, LMAO. And, you know, Twitch jungle and stuff like that was basically like the extent of creativity at that point. And, you know, and then we got down into the actual hero-to-hero interactions I already talked about. That was just sort of the accepted standard. And I think that should have all just been lightened up. All the major counters should have been removed. And then you just balance the game around team versus team, which... that would have been a good idea. But you're talking about a player base that's mostly interacting it from a solo queue or dual queue perspective. The competitive scene is extremely small. And, you know, this is another thing with the raid stuff, is with Final Fantasy XIV, high-end raiders account for like 1% or less than 1% of the player base. And they only release major content for those players specifically. They leave out all the other players. And then you wonder why these people are putting up nightclub billboards in California and stuff like that, and getting shit slung at them for their everything. And because only a tiny amount of fraction of players even engage with most of the game at that stage. And, you know, with League, it's different though. You have most of the people who, because that's the entire game. You don't have a single player or a campaign or anything. As easy as it would be to build for something like that, they never bothered. And it's the solo queue, and it's the MMR, and the MMR in general is going to be frustrating because you're always going to be punished more heavily for losing than being rewarded for winning. Uh, not accounting for a microtransaction currency or whatever you might get out of winning consecutively. But even then, that's not very much. And when you're at a higher, or even not even a high skill level, but just having played enough, you have enough of that currency that you can pretty much pick up any hero you want anyways, right? Like the skins are exclusively locked behind microtransactions. And that means that there's no real reward except for ranking up. And ranking up is supposed to be its own reward, so it's improvement. But the fact is a lot of the times, your losses are not even in your control anyways.
Yes.
One of the reasons why these games foster their well-earned reputation of having what they would call a toxic player base is just because of team-centric play that gets dragged down by the actions of a single person.
Yep.
Like, if somebody feeds their lane, you're fucked. It doesn't matter if you were doing perfectly in yours, except in really specific cases. Like, I still remember the one game I played, I was like 25-1 on mid Nidalee. But my top lane had fed their Darius. And there's nothing I could do against him. He wasn't even that good of a player. I could land spear after spear. It doesn't matter. At that point, he was so fed and so tanky. He had scaled in such a way that there was nothing I could do on the map. I couldn't put advantages on the rest of the map because he would just run into our base, push our base, destroy our inhibitors. And then that was game. And like that feels terrible to go through. And, you can roam, and I did roam, but there are times where you just can't stop a snowball from happening because of these interactions, or even because just circumstances, and you will lose, and that will be that, and you had no real way to pull out of that.
Yeah.
Right? If all your lanes or one of your lanes is feeding or something like that, one person drags the whole team down, and then that, of course, is going to make people feel very angry, and then the loss with the MMR, when they're competitively invested, that's going to hit their points really hard, especially at a high level. And it's going to take however many games to get back. If they're in a promotion series, it's even worse. Like the system, it certainly isn't something like I'm experienced enough to tell you what a good alternative would be. But what I can say is that all of these games, like League and Overweight, they have managed to make people who I figured were like the most mellow people in existence, all of them have succeeded in making them like raging, toxic Xbox teenagers. I've seen sides of these people I've never seen before playing these games before. There is absolutely something going on with the way that these team-centric games are balanced and designed that makes people incredibly frustrated, and counters are really at the center of that.
Right. Well, because it's basically things out of your control. It takes a very different kind of mind to be stoic in the face of things they cannot change. And that's supposed to be a lesson that you put into practice for the express purposes of dealing with stress and improving and like focusing on things you can actually change. It's not supposed to be something you have to put into practice for like a game, usually. I mean, like if you're really seeking improvement, then I can see why you would want to do, like if a game update comes out and you have to relearn some things, then that would be a case where the stoic value could come into play, because then, I couldn't control that, like maybe my favorite playstyle was affected by this update, but I can control learning it and like improving on it. But when it's down to like your teammates like repeatedly being dragging you down and stuff like that. Now, everybody always feels like it's just like in the middle of when you're in traffic, you don't realize you are traffic. You're part of traffic. The same thing happens with Elo Hell in that sense, where people think that they're like constantly maligned. In theory, across a long enough time span, you would rise up if you belonged in a higher MMR, which is the whole like win rate thing, right? Mm-hmm. But in practice, it does feel so terrible that I do think that you get this heavy negative psychic impact just from playing the game at a point where you're actually trying to take things seriously. And if you're not taking it seriously, then you play normals and that's fine. But if you are trying to, and I was when I climbed up to my Diamond 2 promo series, where I destroyed everybody in the first game as Graves, and then my lanes just fed everything in the later two ones.
Was that before they nerfed Graves' cigar?
I think it was after, because it was when he was a jungler.
Oh, see, there's your problem. You didn't have the cigar.
I was close, but no cigar.
I found that fucking hilarious.
Yeah, because China, lol.
Yeah.
So the moral of the story is don't have hard counters as a mindset. Certainly don't think about it like, oh yeah, this guy can't do this because I said so. You know, you were talking about the developer approved thing. Basically, like the developer creates a problem for you and then also sells you a solution, I think is how you phrased it. That's a good way to put it, because that's also been happening in these cinematic games, right? In Dumb Eternal, where you have these fucking cutscenes. Like, the goofiest thing was actually in the DLC for me, because you noticed they just, like, in the middle of combat will fade out and point you to some place that's like a door opening or something. It's like you're still...
Thankfully, I never played the DLC, and I'm not going to, because I can only stomach so much.
Well, I haven't revisited it. I've only played it
you
for like...
You should do it on Nightmare. I want to see how well you do on Nightmare.
AIDS.
You might do better because you've played CS more than me, so you just have better muscle memory than me, but apparently you were still dying all over the place from invisible damage. Anyway, so.
Yeah. It was a good game, that game. Honestly, like, what really offended me most was... I wasn't even fully focused on it for the most part. I had, like, podcasts in the background or something while I was playing, but what really offended me the most was the audio design. There's a particular sound that plays when you're exploring the doors inside your Fortress of Doom, which is like the hub world thing. And as soon as you walk up to a door, it plays this fucking obnoxiously overcompressed, really loud, louder than everything else in the game, like crunching sound of the mechanical slidings. It's a very long process. You have to sit there for like at least a second and a half while the door opens.
Yep.
And there's always two of them back to back in every hallway. So you have to sit through that sound 4 different times and just die. And so I just stopped doing anything in the fucking hub world because that's obnoxious as fuck.
I've waited for you. That game is like a great example of what not to do with audio, and like there is not a worse game for music or general audio design that I can think of.
Agreed.
It is worse than even StarCraft 2 and Diablo 3, and it's really quite an accomplishment.
Yeah, well, there are at least some recognizable sounds in those games. Like, the most you could say is that some of the gun sounds are recognizable, but even then, I was trying to give it that little olive branch. But actually, I can't really remember the sound of BFG relative to, like, the Gauss cannon or whatever. Like, they all sound the same anyway. Never mind. It's all terrible. But,
Mickey Gordon is definitely not somebody I would ever bring onto any kind of project. Holy shit.
Yeah, dude. Well, it's even better when he only sends you 12 songs for that length of a game, and then you rebuild the rest with compressed audio.
They all sound like compressed toilet flushing with random, like, high-pitched ear rape thrown into it.
Yeah. Well, terrible game. We had to mention Dumb Eternal because I just played it recently. So, but it bears a mention in the context of the developer approved thing where you have to do this in this way.
QTEs.
You have the QTEs. You have like, don't try to play the game a different way. Now, it's a tough...
The potion system.
Yeah, it's a tough thing to get into for most people because the argument of the idiot who tries to bring you down to their level and beat you with experience is... Well, every game, it boils down to how the developer allows you to play. But the difference is, again, I think the same kind of difference between hard counter and soft counter is how you get to a solution that the developer would consider valid. If there's like 30,000 solutions that you might be able to do, depending on your skill level and the situation at hand, well, then suddenly that sounds like a much more interesting game where you're given a lot more agency and freedom and respect. If there's only one solution, then why am I even playing it? Because it's just a cameraman game where I'm catching all the good angles of the action and doing the Simon Says. So there's obviously a breadth of possibilities in between those two extremes. But the point is that the more you are on the larger scale, more freedom, more agency side of that spectrum, you're going to be you're going to have a better game on your hands in general because the player will actually be able to interact with something and have their interaction mean something, which is the biggest thing. Like in Half-Life and similar cinematic games, you don't really have the opportunity to make your mark as a player because everything is just like one corridor or you have to do this exact thing to progress. Like in Half-Life 2, there's a sequence where if you don't walk in a certain area, there's a battle that will never stop happening because they just keep spawning in reinforcements and stuff. And it's including like these really big striders that you waste all of your rocket ammo on, which is a pretty important resource. So I just sat there like wondering what the fuck to do. And then I stumbled upon the solution by walking into an area. And then they had like some movie scene where another strider appears and blows up the wall and that lets you go away somewhere. It's like, okay, dude, like fuck off, man. Like, maybe if that was a mechanic where they would destroy the environment, which I would say is probably not reasonable to expect out of a game from 2004, but if that was happening, then great. I can learn that mechanic, and I can apply that in the sense where I can create a path out. But they didn't want it to be dynamic. They just wanted it to be as Simon says. And that's where it gets into this similar mindset of hard counters anyway, is the idea that you just can't have player freedom and player agency. You just got to make it so that they strap themselves in and go down your fucking wild ride there. And only developer-approved solutions work, and there's only like one or two of them. That's the mindset I would definitely like to decry and say that is terrible. Because it just doesn't lend well to interactive media. By definition, it's basically, it's not so far removed from locking you in a viewport and then only showing you the right camera angles, which, by the way, is a movie. That's literally a movie. So, like, why would you put the player in such a situation where the choices, many of the interesting choices, are all made for them by virtue of the hard counter systems or the paths you must go to and the boxes you must tick in order to progress? That just totally rings incoherent to me when I hear somebody talking about those elements within a game, saying that, yeah, they're actually really proud of how they did that in a game. It's like, dude, you did your best to make it not a game by virtue of adding all of these.
Yeah, I mean, the definition of a game is something that provides you with a fun challenge. That's what a game is. A game is a challenge. Now, the solutions to those challenges are always going to be predetermined by some kind of system. That's what a game is. You know, the solution to winning chess is to defeat the king. But, you know, conceptually with chess, you got to get past all the king's other shit to get to the king, or you got to outsmart the king. And the differences are going to be in the interaction concepts. And, you know, you find a very broad line in almost every product between what is an interaction and then what is Simon Says. And I mean, honestly, almost every game that's been released to date is just basically a Simon Says. All the quest-oriented games with all the waypoints and stuff like that telling you to go here, go there, and push this button, push that. It's all a quick time event. That's what it is. Like, Last of Us is one of the most blandest quick time event games I've ever played. And I would never play another game like that. It is so boring. So boring. And I mean, the bugs are funny. Like, the fatty is getting stuck and the NPC shooting at him with his revolver, pretty much never reloading, doing 0 damage. I mean, it's funny, but the games are just so goddamn bland. The fixed patrol paths, you know, go in this, use that. Here's your, you know, QTE item that you can use to instantly kill clickers. And you know, the whole concept was just unbelievable that this is what they had turned what is supposed to be a game into. And you can have a framework that works and still turn it into something that's just as stupid. Like the fucking StarCraft and Brood War campaigns, or the Warcraft 3 campaigns. Like, you had the hero system, and then you go through these micro maps, and your heroes are fixed levels. They can level up like once a map.
Yep.
Like, you don't even go through the process of progression at the absolute maximum. You're grinding through some shit to pick up an item to make something else slightly easier or something like that. You're just basically grinding more time as opposed to, you know, exploring character growth or something like that. And you're not really it's like a linear path on top of it, with any divergence is a fucking secret. That's also pretty much every game in the last like 15 years. It's just a corridor with one like new Dumb Eternal is so, like, both the new Doom reboots are horrible for this, but Dumb Eternal is particularly bad for that, where secrets are literally just like one step to the right every single time. I would be so baffled by the alleged secrets I was getting.
Yeah, I would just stumble upon them thinking I was going the actual path. So.
Yeah, the level design is definitely the worst of any shooter I've played, that's for sure. I would consider even Half-Life to be an improvement over it, which is honestly really shocking. It is just, the whole game end to end is bad. It is easily one of the top 5 worst games I've ever played. And it's just so horrible. It's just like the balance, the potion system with the grenades and the drops and the chainsaws,
the cooldowns, like the fucking infinitely respawning ammo crates.
It's just like Diablo 3. Diablo 3 is infinite potion with the cooldown. That's precisely what that game is. And then they diverged from it in the Maker fight, and I guess you didn't have hardly any problems with that at all. For me, it was a goddamn train wreck, where they just decided just to arbitrarily cut out like half the systems in the game they've been training you to use up to this point, like the chainsaw. And
Yeah,
stuff
I didn't
like
even
that,
know
and
the
just suddenly
chainsaw
decide,
didn't
okay, we're not
affect
gonna
the
deal with that.
drones. I had gone through the whole game right-clicking people because I'm just used to that from CS. So I was pretty accustomed to sniping them, and so and by the way, there's also even on console. I mean, even on PC, after you turn it off in the console, it still has aim assist. So.
Yeah.
Like there was definitely some correction.
It felt like there was less aim assist than the first one because I tried to turn it off too. But you weren't really trained to use the sniper. I mean, you use the sniper pretty much exclusively to destroy the subsystem. And the other subsystems you would destroy, unlike the fatties, it literally did nothing. It wouldn't stop them from two-shotting you. So there was pretty much no point to even bother with that. And, you know, with the lower tier weapons also not really dealing that much damage, other than headshotting like the zombies that were already harmless, you really weren't using that much. You were focusing a lot on trying to balance ammo with the heavier weapons and then saving your cooldowns. And then you reach this other fight where it turns on the top of the shoulder. Now, once I got into the habit of using the ice grenade and freezing them and then headshotting them, it wasn't really that big of an issue. But the fight was just so terribly designed in general. Between, you know, random shots clipping you for half your health from all the way across the map, just the positioning for them and the pathing for them being very hard to corral them, the regenerating health on the boss and the many health bars you had to go through. And when I zone into that fight on my reload, I'm actually missing pretty much all my ammunition. So every single time I rezone into that fight, I have to hide away from the tracking laser beam that turns half the map into a damage volume. And wait for the drones to come to me and then try to get a shotgun shot on their heads with the super shotgun, which was extremely hard to do because I guess the spread or the hit test on it is really broad. And even when you're right in front of them, it's very hard to get an actual headshot on them with that.
Yeah, that kind of feels incredibly inconsistent because sometimes I'd be bricking people from long range and then other times I wouldn't. So it might just be random. I don't know. Like, that's one of the things where you'd think by the end of the game you would actually have a pretty good conception of it, but of course, they don't introduce the gun until like 3 or 4 levels in. And then on top of it, you just don't get to use most of the guns for a very long period of time, a prolonged period of time, because of the ammo
You don't need
scarcity.
to, but also you don't want to because they're so inefficient compared to something else. And the health of enemies reaches such an insane proportion, and the lethality is so high, and the maps are so small that usually you do not have much time to be messing around.
Well, those Marauder enemies, you actually need something like the super shotgun in order to even stun them, so it's kind of weird because they basically...
You gotta do the Simon Says.
Yeah, that's the Simon Says hard counter mentality. The thing about the Dumb Eternal case is also that, like, I made this point on the server, but... if you complete all of the side Slayer challenges that teleport you into a different arena temporarily, you actually encounter all of these enemies with no fanfare, and they just start attacking you. Like, you encounter them like a level or two early. And it's like, oh, okay, that's a new enemy, and I guess I'll fight later. Like, the Maker drones I fought in the middle of... they were obviously something completely different. I didn't know what the fuck they were. I didn't get any information. I guess I probably got a codex entry. I just, like, zoned those out entirely. But you don't get the fucking obnoxious pop-up that literally tells you how to play the game and how to defeat them. But then you go and fight them, and you get the obnoxious pop-up, like, when they're introduced in the level. And... like, that's just... it's obvious that they literally made a system, this obnoxious pop-up, zoom, pause the game, tell you everything about the enemy, play a shitty flash video. That whole system that they added literally makes the game worse. It adds nothing.
Oh, yeah, the flash videos are terrible.
Yeah, it's...
because they're recorded on, like, fixed settings and lowest difficulty, too. So they give you a completely unrealistic expectation of what's actually going to happen.
Or the enemy's already at, like really low HP or something. So, yeah.
I never understood the idea of injecting flash videos into your game. That is something that's been happening for a while now.
Yeah, StarCraft 2 did it for all their upgrades.
They're always compressed so badly, and they look so horrible. And then you get spinners on top of it. Like, the whole interaction is just... whatever drove people to do this, I don't know, but they need to stop.
Yeah, I mean, it would be nice if at least they weren't fucking compressed nonsense. The point is I suppose it's supposed to give you some expectation of what the unit can do, but like a trailer for the unit almost or something in an RTS context.
I think it's because people can't read.
Yeah.
Like, I guess the average player for their games is illiterate, so they have to show like a little video to see what happens.
Yeah, I mean, it speaks to a point where maybe the players just aren't able to imagine the ramifications of an upgrade or something, but also it could be that like maybe the upgrades are not worded very intelligently or something. I don't know. Like, I always found it weird that they even bothered showing videos for some of the upgrades, and then some of them they didn't for the weapons in Doom and Doom Eternal. So, yeah, I wanted to make the point about the Slayer thing and how that you get these like no introduction enemies versus the actual stupid introduction. And it's like obviously this other extra system just subtracts value from the game and treats you like a complete
they
idiot.
just slapped it in there.
You know.
I think I tried one of them once and it was like, yeah, it wasn't worth it, and just moved on. Like, they're just extra bloat. They serve no purpose in the game whatsoever. I don't know why they even exist.
The other thing is the Maker fight is interesting too in the same way, because it's not just that they tell you like weak spots for the boss or something, which would be egregious enough. They literally say, here, like, do this and then do that, and then the boss will take a point of damage. It's like,
yeah.
Like, how many times do you have to write like a Simon Says literally in text form and put it in front of the player before you realize that what you're doing is not actually conducive to designing a game? Like, how many times?
It sounds stupid, and then you've got this awkward like difference cloud effect on the ground that will damage you climbing over it and jumping over it, and that one fucking dialogue line that she plays. She only got the one. That she says constantly every time I think it was when it summons the laser that chases you around. Since I was stuck in that fight for quite a while, that fucking dialogue line was just driving me out. Like, it was clear that this had never been tested.
Of course not.
Nobody had ever even spent more than like 2 seconds looking at this, because they would have not had this one voice line playing non-stop.
Yeah, would rather have no
just
voice lines if you only have one as an option.
It was so grating. It was terrible.
Oh yeah, I guess that's a piggyback off of the dialogue bit that you were talking about. One of the things you've referenced for a while now is you have the system had planned in Apex where if you listen to a dialogue event, it wouldn't play. I was going to evolve this system in my mind by having variants of the event, because sometimes the event is used as literally a read for like something that's happened on the map, and maybe that's a system that could be attacked separately. But my idea was that if for example, you have some dialogue that's meant to welcome a new player onto the map, like a new force is arriving and they're like somebody's responding to it, or something to that effect, where it's clearly like a state change and something that should be accounted for, then one of the ideas I had was to just have much more truncated versions of the same dialogue event and a couple variants. So basically on repeat playthroughs, the first time you play, and if you reset the dialogue bank or whatever, then you would hear the full event, and that would always be the same. But then when you on repeat playthroughs, or if you've restarted the mission but you've already heard that part, you would get a truncated version so that it would never become grating, and you would just have this very short and to the point, like, assuming you already heard the meaty like big version of it, like okay, you just go straight to this like to the point one where they're back again, or another enemy is coming in or something to that effect, where like it's much more condensed, but also there's like many variants of it. That way, I feel like that's a way to keep the benefit of it not being grating, like you were saying, with dialogue events that are heard repeatedly every time you restart the mission or retry it or something, but also preserve whatever read might be there and help remind the player of the characters that are speaking to them if they are not actually on the map as well, or something to that effect. I didn't know if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That's I would probably do the same thing. I hadn't written it out that way in the scripts, but I think I was just not going to skip objective-based dialogue.
Sure, yeah.
And I think I tried to keep that concise in general.
Yeah.
No, that makes perfect sense.
So yeah, that's we're kind of running out on time here, because of course it is going to be Fraud Night soon. But
we're going to be frauds soon. More fraudy.
Fraud. So I wasn't sure if you had any fraudulent or not fraudulent commentary to close out this cast over, because I do think we covered a lot of different mechanics, and obviously, like, we teased out some of the ideas about dialogue and character discussion that might be the next or a future episode or something. So we've done the job. We've successfully set the big boys' table for dinner. So I'm not sure if you had anything else to mention, but I do think one of the biggest lessons from this one is definitely the hard counter mindset and the whole like designer having everything rote in mind. Like, yes, you're always going to do it this way, and yes, there's no player freedom allowed, and very minimal choice and very minimal expression. I think we've successfully argued against that, and I wasn't sure if you had any other final words on any of the subjects that have been covered.
I'm just looking at the other subjects we didn't do, like economics and
Sure, yeah.
workers and upgrades and stuff, and I was like, well, if I got into workers, that'd probably be a long one because that's like, I feel like everything in the game the players should be interacting with, and there should be absolutely no automation whatsoever. Like the very new trend, the very new Reddit trend to try to automate
Yeah.
economy in RTS games is complete and utter horseshit, is cancer. The people doing it are obviously bad at games. They couldn't figure out how to saturate minerals, so they're going to try to dumb down the game to their
Yeah.
level. But there is absolutely a point where it reaches, like, at what stage should you be, like, should you be manually sending back every worker? Probably
Yeah,
not.
yeah.
So at what point do you reach an automation with that? So that's something that you would probably want to think about. But I think that StarCraft has a very good balance with that. And I think that any economic model you make for any RTS should be using StarCraft as a basis, even if it's something completely different like Supreme Commander. Problem with Supreme Commander's economic system is it's very static and it's very non-interactive. The only part you can interact with it is by destroying power generators. And then if the player ends up choking out their resources or something like that. Like the early game for Supreme Commander is a very fixed thing, very fixed in what you do. And not screwing it up is basically your first ticket to becoming a top tier player in that. Once you can get through the early game of Supreme Commander without choking out your matter or your power and being able to build stuff consistency while not floating, congratulations, you're in the top 1% in that game. You pretty much have nothing else to learn after that. But then the economic system, you basically just cease interacting with it, cease paying attention to it, other than trying to destroy enemy power generators in the later parts of the game, because you start reaching a point where it becomes something that becomes sidelined. It's more difficult to manage. You're only really halfway paying attention to it. You're just trying to make numbers bigger. Whereas in StarCraft, you're always paying attention to the workers, which means you always have an investment in the workers, what they're doing, making sure that you're not mined out, making sure you're saturated and stuff like that. But they're automated to the point that once you start harvesting, they're harvesting, and that's that. You don't have to worry about it anymore. So I think it's good that you're interacting with it, but you're not having to do manual chores. So I think StarCraft 1 precisely has a perfect balance with that. What a lot of people are looking at with these economic models, and probably why they view it negatively, is they're looking at StarCraft 2, which is terrible. Because you have auto mine rallying, and then on top of it you have these stupid macro mechanics. And now that Blizzard has polluted the terminology pool in more ways than just maps and mods, which I still see people mixing that up to present day. Now we have these macro mechanics, and now people think that everything macro and mechanic oriented has to be this stupid 2-3 minute cooldown button you just have to push just for the fuck of it. God no. The addition of those to the games was some of the most mind-blowingly stupid things I'd ever seen Blizzard do in the history of that company. It was because the game had become so easy to play. And they knew it was easy to play, but they didn't want to dial back. They didn't want to admit that they had made mistakes elsewhere in the product, so they created these arbitrary things that you had to do. You had to do them. You can't ignore them because it's build speed, it's larva, it's mining. You need these in order to perform. Then they're a chore because they're arbitrary. They're there just to be there for those number manipulation. They're nothing you're even directly interacting with at any point. Is literally just push a button and stuff happens. Wow, great. That's so exciting. It's precisely the kind of stuff you want to avoid. So when you start dealing with economic systems within the RTS specifically, I mean, even within an FPS, something like the ammunition within Dumb Eternal is terribly done. And absolutely terribly done. It wasn't that great in the first Doom reboot, but it was a hell of a lot better than Dumb Eternal. Yep. And that's his own thing, but that's still an economic thing because ammunition management and conservation and managing your different power budgets on your weapons, your early game ones that don't do very much damage versus your high end ones that maybe have less ammunition, do a lot of damage. That's its own economic model as well. And you don't want to enter these systems with the mindset that I don't want players to I think the problem with Dumb Eternal is they saw that the remote detonate on the rocket launcher was absolutely busted as all fuck within the first Doom. And they knee-jerked into blanket nerfing all ammunition. And then they knee-jerked into blanket nerfing the remote detonate on the rocket launcher and making that just completely castrated compared to the first game. Because in the first game, I believe you could double dip damage volumes on it. Where if you detonated it really close to something, you get 2 damage procs off of it. That's how I believed what was happening, because its damage was really high, and that was the bread and butter weapon of that game. With that weapon, you could do just about anything. And you didn't even have to be paying attention to what was going on behind you. You could just shoot, forget, detonate based on time, and you would get good mileage out of it. Couldn't do that in Dumb Eternal. They really didn't like that kind of gameplay, because if you were able to place the rockets like that and keep track of them in your head where they were, you could get so much mileage out of rounding corners and staying safe. Dumb Eternal, they just blanket nerfed all this shit, and they just made it very, very, very lockstep. And then they balanced all the ammo drops, all the arenas, and then your chainsaw cooldown on top of it. And then they infinitely respawned the small enemies to chainsaw, because they realized you'd run out of ammo very easily because of the health values. So that was a really awful boilerplate on top of it. They brought in 2 fucking negatives to try to blanket over an existing negative. Infinitely respawning enemies.
The whole ammo system.
Cooldown-centric bullshit, just because they didn't know how to deal with you running out of ammunition, because they had nerfed ammunition so much. And like with the economic models, when you start reaching these kind of interactions, the whole thing is just to step back and readdress the whole thing and ask, what is it that we want to accomplish? Well, we want to have the player think about ammunition. Well, that's great. So what's the problem with the ammunition when the player's not thinking about it? Oh, we have arena, corridor, and all of them are just filled with thousands of ammunition pickups. So what's our solution to that? It isn't blanket nerf everything, add in a cooldown for all your ammunition, and then spawn enemies and have these fucking arena-based maps to begin with. No, maybe we should think about how we distribute ammunition pickups, or how the player restores ammunition, and maybe we should get away from having enemies drop ammunition, or only have enemies drop ammunition and just have them drop it all the time. Then we can keep focused on players versus enemies, rather than player focused on cooldowns and finding the infinitely respawning enemies to cooldown. Like, you change the entire way a shooter is being interacted with just because you're fucking around in the economic model underlying with how ammunition is being distributed. Needlessly. Completely needlessly. It was just completely needless to even get into that rat's nest to begin with. With the same sense that if you start automating all the workers within StarCraft, you start crossing again into StarCraft 2, even just as a concept that the player doesn't have to pay attention to their base anymore. We want them to pay attention to their base. We got to introduce something else. No, you get into what would be construed as feature creep, but it's really just retardation creep.
I definitely agree on the retardation angle. Yeah, for Doom, it's like the original Doom games, you just got ammo from certain enemies. So, like, there would be a machine gunner enemy that drops ammo for your machine gun. And then there would be shotgun enemies that drop ammo for your shotgun. And then there would be, like, demons that have plasma weapons or something that drop ammo for some plasma gun stuff. And then you'd also have the pickups in certain areas that maybe you have to platform to or get to in some way, or find a secret or something. So there's like a consistent way where it's always the same, instead of this QTE nonsense where you're completely changing how a shooter is interacted with, like you were saying. And it also doesn't require some stupid cooldown stuff either. Obviously, if you wanted to make the chainsaw spill out shit like a piñata, then maybe you should make the chainsaw a regular weapon that you swing with, like a melee attack. Mm-hmm. And when it deals...
God, the lock-on behavior for those weapons is just so awkward at the best of times.
Yeah, and it also makes you temporarily invincible, but allows enemies to catch up to you. So it's like bad in the terms of I don't want to be made invincible because of an animation, because that's really dumb. I'm not playing Dark Souls, thank you very much. And then also, I don't want to have my movement restricted in a game that's really just about being mobile. Like, that's what the original Doom games were really about, is you move faster in that game than like some vehicles do in Halo. So the whole point is that, like, you're very mobile as a character, and you sort of testing your skills with positioning. Dumb Eternal is basically just juggling a bunch of high HP enemies while you search for the low HP ones to chainsaw. So it is really stupid gameplay.
Very often.
A gameplay loop, in fact. A really stupid game.
And it's bad, too, because you get that sword that's supposed to be your ticket to killing high HP enemies. But because of the lock-on system...
It's terrible.
You can actually lock on random imps in their legs. And that happened to me in my run, where I would try to kill one of those tyrants, and it would just kill like some imp that I didn't even see on my fucking screen, because I locked onto him on his leg instead of the big enemy that I was pointing at. And like, I guess like he was just ever so slightly closer to the crosshair, even though I couldn't even see him. And that happened a number of times, which of course is devastating because now you just burn the cooldown you get once like every 10, 15 minutes tops. And you just killed a harmless enemy when now you've got like 8,000 health worth of meat to slowly slap through, who might just randomly kill you out of the blue with a tracking projectile around a corner. So it's just...
It's a confluence of
so
terrible
stupid.
design decisions.
It's just... Like, how do you even reach the point where you publish a product with staffing that's this stupid?
The other thing that I wanted to touch on is you were talking about economics and workers and stuff like that. And for me, I think that one angle I think it will be an improvement, but it will be very different for sure over the StarCraft economic model is if resource nodes, for one, don't require a command center to be built far away from it. So that like they don't impact building placement at all, because that's, in my view, that's just like a unit ID specific like hard code basically. It's like some weird hard counter mentality in my opinion, where it's just like this operates fundamentally differently in terms of how you place it. Instead you just have unbuildable terrain if you want to balance that as a mapper. And then, so resource nodes don't do that. Resource nodes can be harvested from multiple subsequent times. Like you can have multiple workers doing it at the same time. And then you just make workers themselves actually have pathing and collision while they're harvesting and moving to harvest. Suddenly, you don't want to put your town center right up next to a resource node, because that will restrict how many workers can subsequently harvest it at the same time, and also maybe impact pathing in that area. And also, if you remove the automatic behavior of like, oh, this node is occupied, therefore I will go find another node, because now you can do simultaneous harvesting, so you wouldn't want that automation anyway. Then your smart rally thing, where your contextual order is applied based on the target, is consistent with everything else, and not actually automation that makes it so that you never have to look at your base again, because you have to update the rally target to point to nodes that aren't being like saturated by a number of workers simultaneously, and you have to respect pathing with it and all this other stuff. So that requires a lot of other systems. Like you need really good pathfinding that no RTS has ever shown. You need obviously the whole system of like the nodes themselves being maybe variable in size and yield, and you need all this other stuff, these other gameplay systems in place. But I do think it would yield a richer interaction basis, and you wouldn't have to worry about automation getting in the way of things, and you also wouldn't have to worry about these weird gimmick things like the pathing collision thing and the placement stuff around resource nodes. Again, it would be very different than Brood War, and so maybe it would go through some growing pains, I think is a fair estimation. However, I do think it's just, in general, going to be a more deep method of engaging with resource harvesting, because now you can have stuff like that smart rally thing without totally corrupting the whole point of looking at your base, or completely removing that from the estimation. Because now there's a genuine reason to do that. It's not like a chore. It's like, oh, I need to evaluate what resource nodes are going to be best for my early workers to harvest versus my later ones. And so I do need to update the rallies then, and I need to like tell them to harvest a different one or whatever if I see some issue crop up or what have you. And if you, especially even more so, if you can upgrade the node by building something on it similar to a Vespene Geyser and a Terran Refinery in Brood War, then that suddenly that adds another level. Is like, okay, do I want to upgrade the farther ones? Do I want to upgrade the closer ones? Like I have to shut down production or harvesting on this node until it's done, so I got to make a decision about that. So there's all these things that I think can play into it, and you're starting to see us explore with those in Cosmonarchy Brood War a little bit, where we've got the Vespene Geysers harvestable without the structure on top, but you put the structure on top to increase the yield. Then I think you can start to see us try to experiment with this in a way where it isn't just, it's not removing depth from the game. If anything, it's adding depth, or maintaining depth, but making the depth that's there actually relevant to more interesting decisions. I kind of liken it, it's not really the same thing, but I kind of liken it to making the Dragoon not retarded when you're moving it up ramps, so that you can focus on more interesting decisions instead of having to babysit units up ramps. That's kind of how I would analogize it anyway. I'm not sure if you have any opinions on it.
I'm interested to see it, but I'm really skeptical about the pathfinding. I think it'll be really awkward, especially, I think you're going to have to try to fool around with the pathfinding, because like StarCraft as it is, I can't see it handling worker collisions.
I don't think StarCraft will be, I don't think we'll be able to prototype it inside Cosmonarchy Brood War for sure, because what it requires is, if people are interested and know the technical jargon, we're going to be doing hierarchical path planning, which does use A star as the algorithm, which basically will help us read all static objects. And then we'll use the flow fields that we already have in Antikythera as ways for avoidance. So that's unit-to-unit avoidance when two units are moving past each other, or there are multiple moving objects. That's what taps into flow fields. And then we use the other system for static objects, which would be units that are not moving, would be treated as static objects, which would solve a lot of problems. Like, even right now, StarCraft can't tell that you're like blocked by two supply depots in a wall somewhere. Like, you can't tell that. Like, the unit doesn't know that. So,
well, Warcraft 3 can't do that either.
So like that's what hierarchical path planning would solve in part. It would also allow for dynamic terrain, which is a big deal because we want like moving platforms that you can also move units on top of and stuff, which is just unthinkable right now. So, but yeah, I also am aware that it seems like anybody who would have studied this problem would have probably thought that anybody trying to solve it would have to really do some crazy shit. But we have an idea to explore, and so I think it'll work out at the end of the time. It definitely hinges. I think
it's worth exploring for sure. Yeah, I think it's worth exploring. It's you'll have problems, but I think any idea is going to have problems in its implementation.
Yeah. So
it might lead to you trying something different or hammering out some ideas, and even just as a proof, it would tell you, why it doesn't.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, maybe it works totally fine in terms of the implementation, but it actually doesn't yield the better results on a conceptual level or something. Yeah, then we would at least know why and maybe be able to improve upon it, or we would revert back to the old system with confidence, knowing that we explored the other options. So there's definitely value to it, I think, but that's more of a distant revision since I don't think we can replace the pathing system in Brood War, although it would be nice because it's quite terrible. Even that's another one of those things.
Probably would be a lot of work, a lot of reverse engineering.
Yeah, stuff that's just not even documented for the most part. So, but I think that's we're coming to our close. We just cracked 2 hours, which is not 3, but that's okay.
Not 3
because you can't have 3 all the time, dude. You got to figure it out.
No. Sometimes you got to have 5 or 7.
Yep, exactly. And there's
very rarely 9 or 15. For getting real avant-garde here.
That's might be illegal in some circles, depending on how conservative they are. They might be really tethered to the old ways.
All right. Well, that's all I got then.
Smoke weed, homie.
Smoke weed every day.